Hi, folks. Give us a few seconds as folks join us for this 45 minutes on webinar, part of the Aluminium Stewardship Initiative's 45 minutes on series. I think the last one, certainly the one that I did a couple of weeks ago, was on CBAM, Europe's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, and there was significant interest there around reporting requirements and requirements to access markets. And I guess we carry on that theme today with the webinar with RMI, who we at ASI have been working with for a few years now, actually, in a number of different spaces. Today, we're going to be focusing on the recently launched Aluminium Greenhouse Gas Emissions Reporting Guidance, published by RMI a couple of weeks ago at COP28. And for this webinar, I'm delighted to be joined today by Nicole Labouton, Principal with RMI, Wenjuan Liu, Manager with RMI, and Shravan Chalasani, Senior Associate with ASI. You will see some other names on screen, Ila Barbosa and Hao Wu, who are supporting the RMI group today. Welcome, folks. I'm going to hand over to you in a moment. That's really the meat of today, is to get the presentation from RMI on the published guidance. And it's also an opportunity for you, the attendees, to ask questions. So I really do encourage you to use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to ask your questions of the RMI team. There'll also be the opportunity, of course, afterwards, she'll share their contact details at the end. Maybe to begin with, is to say that the Aluminium Stewardship Initiative has been working with RMI really for a couple of years now, at the same time as working on our own greenhouse gas emissions reduction methodology, the 1.5 degree aligned pathways methodology, which we plan to publish in January. And our main focus over that period has been harmonization, has been ensuring that we're using similar data sets in similar ways, we're scoping processes in similar ways to meet the demands of lots of different stakeholders for lots of different reasons. So we talked last time round about CBAM and the regulatory requirements and how they were slightly misaligned with ASI's requirements, but how you could build data sets to meet both of those. And so that's the theme for today, is about the harmonization of our approaches. And with that, I'm delighted to hand over to the RMI team to talk about their GHG emissions reporting guidance and look forward to your questions later on. So with that, please, I'll hand over to the RMI team to take it away.
Great, thank you. My name is Nicole Labouton, and I'm a principal with RMI's Climate Intelligence Program, where we're enabling the development of climate differentiated markets. And so before diving into aluminum in particular, I wanted to give you a bit of the greater context of our work. We believe that one of the key enablers of climate differentiated markets is helping companies make informed purchase decisions with better data. And we acknowledge there are several challenges that need to be overcome. For example, reconciling and harmonizing the many accounting methods available, giving companies more accurate data, and giving them the most relevant data. We aim to get to the heart of what is driving supply chain emissions, that is, emissions intensities of what is bought and sold. And to make better sense of that data, we're promoting consistent reporting boundaries so that the data captures what emissions companies can manage. This consistency also creates comparability for ease in evaluating emissions performance across suppliers and commodities. In addition, with the right technologies, such as interoperable data formats that help transmit that consistent and robust data, we can increase the availability of that data. And so that's the greater context. Now Wenjuan will speak on what that means for the aluminum sector in particular.
Thanks, Nicole. And hello, everyone. I will give everybody a little bit of overview of the aluminum GHG emissions reporting guidance that RMI is developing, and also give you some background information about what kind of process that we have gone through in terms of the public consultation that has been launched in June and July this year and finalized by this month and got the final guidance be published. So in terms of the overall goal and the aim that we want to achieve for this guidance, so in general, we want to drive the availability of more transparent and comparable climate data. And those climate data are comprehensively discussed and designed to drive the decarbonization actions that can be happening in the industry. And for producers, we hope this guidance would be able to help them improve the emissions transparency and help them demonstrate the decarbonization efforts that they have done in their production. And for the buyers, we hope this guidance would be able to help buyers to better identify those climate leading suppliers. And also, we hope by collaboration between producers and buyers, this guidance would overall drive the low carbon procurement spendings more towards the decarbonization technologies or reduction efforts. In the next slide, we listed out, the slide is moving, yeah. So in the next slide, we listed out some of the key metrics that are documented in the guidance. So first of all, this is a product level carbon accounting methodology, and we use a fixed boundary approach, which is from cradle to gate to calculate emissions at product level. And on top of that, we also have a benchmarking boundary where it captures all the common processes that for all the products, so that the buyers would be able to directly compare the products, an apple-to-apple comparison, basically. And for scrap, we also have specified the definitions for different types of scrap. We require an extra disclosure of the post-consumer scrap so that we can better drive and incentive the recycling and the use of the post-consumer scrap. And for electricity, because electricity is widely used by the aluminum production, especially for the primary production, we also recommended the best practice for electricity procurement, especially for those that are buying electricity either from grid or from other sources. And lastly, for data, we have a specific metric, which is called primary data fraction, to drive the more and more use of a supplier-specific primary data. But I will not give more details about what we have in the guidance, but to be more focused on the public consultation process we have, which is on this slide. So as I mentioned before, we launched the guidance, the public consultation phase of the guidance in the CRU World Aluminum Conference this year. And then we started the consultation in July, and I believe we have received a lot of feedback from this cohort through ASI. And after we closed the public consultation, we firstly gone through the process of compiling all the responses, trying to figure out what are the categories of different responses and how we can address them and incorporate them into the guidance revision. And before we incorporate everything, we also had several rounds of one-on-one consultation, especially with the companies or organizations that we have not talked with them previously. And then after those talks and then several rounds of the internal discussions and research, we were finally able to finalize the feedback incorporation process and then launch the guidance at COP this year. In the next slide, where you can see a overview of the respondents that we collected the feedback from the consultation process. So in general, I think we have collected the comments has a pretty good, pretty broad coverage in terms of the geography and the supply chain actors. So we have received the respondents from tons of different countries and companies, and also both primary producers and secondary producers, and also some of the end buyers and recyclers, etc. So it's a pretty good combination of a good representation of the diverse views in the industry. And the next slide is a process shows our engagement with the respondents, where we had one-on-one meetings. Also, we have also published a response summary on our website to share the overview of the feedback. And then today we are hosting this webinar to walk through the feedback we collected so far and how we integrate them. So this webinar is not really to introduce what we have in the guidance, but to give more information about what kind of responses that we collected and what are the process we incorporate them, and what are the decision-making process and rationale that we have conducted internally to decide if we want to, or like if it is good to incorporate some of the responses and why we're not incorporating some of the responses. So in the next slide, we categorized all of the responses by the different topic categories here. And now I'm giving the stage to my colleague Sravan to walk you through all the comments we received and also how we incorporate those responses.
All right. Thanks, Wenjuan. Hello, everyone. Over the next 15 minutes or so, I will summarize the key feedback that we have received in each of the major topics that Wenjuan just described, and how we incorporated the feedback in the current version of the guidance that is published on our website. So the way we summarize the feedback is that we have the main topics on the left-hand side of the slide you see here with the key feedback and the outcome written down. We have also tried to color code how we incorporated the feedback into the guidance document, with green being the feedback fully incorporated, yellow being the feedback partly incorporated, and red being the feedback not being incorporated in the guidance. If you want to have a more detailed look, we have posted the feedback slides on our website along with our guidance document. Feel free to check it out later. Now, first on the topic of boundary setting, we have modified the boundary diagram in the guidance to avoid any confusion while interpreting the benchmarking and the full boundaries. The benchmarking boundary is until the production of the final cast house product, like slab billet or primary foundry alloy. The full boundary definition was modified to be a little bit more flexible based on the producer. This was decided as a result of our experiences piloting our guidance in a few real-world scenarios. Through the pilot, we learned that there could be some fabrication processes boundary in our full boundary that were not mentioned in the previous version of the guidance. Therefore, the full boundary can include emissions from source fabrication activities depending on the final product that is being produced. On the topic of alloy emissions, previously we have excluded them from the emission intensity calculation, but based on the feedback we received, we have decided to include alloy emissions for the emission intensity calculations for both the boundaries wherever relevant. We recommend the use of prime substitution approach for including alloy emissions, which means that assuming alloy emissions have the same emissions as the primary aluminum that is produced. We have also received a few comments related to the transportation emissions and scrap collection and sorting emissions, and that they should be included in the emission intensity calculations. We chose to keep them excluded in our guidance because it makes it easy to compare the reported emission metrics against the aluminum sectoral decarbonization pathways that are available. And also excluding transportation and scrap collection emissions makes it consistent with our product level steel guidance that we mentioned previously. Over to the next slide. Next, on the topic of mine to smelter emission intensity, we have received some feedback that additional clarity is needed on this metric. We have provided the clarity by saying that this mine to smelter emission intensity would be the total emissions associated with making the primary metal divided by the total primary metal output, excluding any scrap metal that is added. So there was a general agreement that this metric would provide needed transparency for the primary metal decarbonization. Next slide. Now, we received a lot of comments on the definition of scrap in our guidance. First, on the topic of permanent melt loss and inclusion of dross or salt slag, we have clarified that any permanent melt loss from the facility through spills and such is removed from the overall scrap-based content calculation. Also, any net aluminum input from dross or other aluminum-containing waste is counted as part of our scrap definition. Other than that, as expected, we have received mixed feedback on the topic of whether on-site semi-fabrication scrap from rolling mills or other semi-fabrication processes shall be included in the scrap content definition. Some respondents agree that the definition of the pre-consumer scrap should be separated from the facility integration level, which is what we tried to do with our scrap content definition, while other respondents suggested that the scrap content should be calculated at the semis product level rather than at the ingot level, excluding the internal semi-fabrication scrap from the scrap content definition. Given these diverse viewpoints, we stuck with our definition of scrap-based content that is defined against the fixed benchmarking boundary for the value-added product. The main rationale here for keeping our definition of scrap-based content is that it is independent of the facility integration level, but more importantly, through our pilot process, we have noticed that downstream users of aluminum are asking for more transparency around the data they receive from their aluminum suppliers. For instance, one automaker is planning to request information from their suppliers around how much scrap used in the supplied products is internal process scrap versus scrap purchased externally versus scrap collected through a closed loop process. We believe these kind of requests for additional transparency will become more and more common in the coming years. And given this push for transparency, we thought our definition of scrap-based content makes sense. Again, I want to highlight that despite these discussions around nuances of scrap definitions, one thing most people seem to agree on is the need to increase post-consumer scrap usage within the aluminum industry. There also seems to be a general consensus that reporting of post-consumer scrap share is useful. Therefore, we want to emphasize that reporting of the post-consumer scrap share is more important than the overall scrap-based content value. There were a few comments around whether mass balance-based allocation for scrap-based content would be allowed. We added a statement saying that generally it is not allowed, given that this kind of mass balancing could be misused if it is not properly verified. If we can go to the next slide. Next, again, we have received lots of feedback on this topic of reporting emission intensity using the cutoff method and the co-product allocation method. First, there were some comments that said both the approaches were not given equal weightage in the text of the document. We tried to make sure that both approaches get a fair treatment. We modified the text a little bit. And the rest of the comments focused on the fact that it is hard to get reliable data on embodied emissions of scrap, and the use of regional default values for scrap embodied emissions might not be a suitable option. There are also concerns that too much reporting can create confusion among the buyers who receive the data. In the guidance, we did acknowledge the challenges with getting accurate data, but we maintain this concept of dual reporting. And one of the main reasons for this is that, again, based on our experience from the piloting process, we feel that just having this sort of dual reporting framework forces aluminum producers to think about where their scrap is coming from. And we feel that this can lead to better data collection and traceability related to scrap. And eventually, it can lead to better sourcing of scrap, which is the behavioral change that we want to see in the industry. And we also mentioned that if reliable data on scrap embodied emissions is not available, regional default values can be used for now. We can go to the next slide. Now, on the topic of energy impacts and coming to the hierarchy of power transition or power purchase options at the smelting facility, most respondents agreed that the hierarchy that we provided in the guidance, which is first prioritizing the transition of on-site self-generation facilities from fossil fuel-based production to renewable energy, purchasing renewable electricity from on-site installations, which may be owned by some third-party suppliers, and then procurement of off-site grid-connected renewable energy generators through PPAs and so forth. This kind of hierarchy is useful. This hierarchy also aligns with ISO standards. So we kept this decision hierarchy as it is in the guidance. We also recommend the use of both location-based and market-based methods for electricity emissions. If only one method is used, the reporting entity shall disclose which of the two methods was used. We also say that for the market-based method, residual emission factors shall be used whenever required. Now, on the topic of renewable energy credit allocation for a specific product portfolio, some respondents said that it shall not be allowed, while some said that it may be necessary in some situations. We maintain that allocating renewable energy benefits to a product portfolio is not recommended in our guidance, mainly, again, because such an arrangement can be misused if not verified properly. Next slide. Now, regarding some data metrics around data quality, regarding primary data definition, we provided more clarity on how this shall be calculated. We also made sure that our primary data share definition aligns with WVCSD's Pathfinder framework. We also added a short description about the data quality rating metric in our guidance. Next slide. Now, we were also considering the inclusion of a technology label in our guidance that describes what kind of technology was used to produce the aluminum. A lot of respondents commented that such a label would require third-party certification to be useful, and there could be potential issues with FTC green guidelines. So therefore, we decided not to include language around a technology label in our guidance. Next slide. Now, we have received a few questions about how our aluminum guidance compares to our product level steel emissions reporting guidance. So we tried to put a slide together that compares the key aspects of both these documents. For the most part, there is consistency between both the documents, especially when it comes to the fixed boundary, scrap content definition, and primary data definitions. The only time the aluminum guidance is a little bit different compared to the steel is regarding the topic of scrap embodied emissions. The steel guidance uses the cutoff approach, while in the aluminum guidance, we recommended the dual reporting approach. And the main reason, in addition to what I've described previously, is the issue of scrap embodied emissions has not been raised that much in the steel working group meetings. While in the case of aluminum, we had to dedicate a separate working group session just to discuss this one topic. And scrap is a much more important issue in aluminum compared to steel. Also, for the aluminum guidance, we have explicitly mentioned the use of life cycle emission factors for electricity emissions, whereas in steel, we have not mentioned that explicitly. And the reason for that, again, being for aluminum, electricity contributes to a significant portion of the product's overall footprint, and other industry guidelines recommend the use of life cycle emission factors. So that's a summary of the feedback that we received and the decisions that we have made for the current version of our guidance. And now I will pass it over to Wenjuan to talk a little bit about what activities we have planned for the next year and some collaboration opportunities.
Sure, thanks, Shravan. So in the upcoming a year of the work that we are looking forward now, so first of all, we have already started our pilot testing processes with the producers and buyers who are interested in the methodology, mainly to test, first of all, how what are the feasibility looks like for producers who want to use this methodology to do the calculations, and also how those data, like collected data, can be incorporated or like it can be used by the buyers to make their business decisions for different perspectives. So we have mostly finished all of the pilots for the aluminum sector, and we are looking at Q1 next year to publish our outcomes. And if you're interested in more details and how you can apply the guidance in your supply chain, feel free to reach out to us. We can set up some of the one-on-one conversations to walk you through the methodology in more details and share more of the experience and learning that we have in the pilot testing. And at the same time, we are expanding our work to other geographies. For example, we are actively localizing the guidance in China to figure out what are the challenge for calculation for the producers, aluminum producers in China. We have conducted a workshop in China last month to discuss the methodology and collect the feedback, and also what kind of challenge that people are facing in China and what are the buyers that think about this method. And lastly, we are also exploring opportunities for broader collaboration, especially for the capacity building for the calculations, to real awareness of the transparency of the scrap and the importance of decarbonizing the primary production, and also try to foster more and more supply chain collaborations so that we can promote more sustainable procurement practices. And we think this set of the work is very important is because from the learnings of those pilots, we realized actually there is a huge gap in data collection where the buyers will take a lot of effort to collect data, especially those product lab data from all of their suppliers with different level of knowledge and capacity in doing calculations. So we realized this gap, and we are actively seeking collaboration opportunities to help fill this gap and to help improve the data calculation collection practices in the industry. Okay, I will stop it here, and then I will hand it over back to Chris, and then I think we're ready for the questions.
Thank you very much. Thanks, folks. We've got some questions coming in. I've also got some that came in beforehand as well. But I've got a question to begin with, and it's maybe a larger philosophical question, as I want to do. And that is to ask, does differentiation, climate differentiation, does it drive action? Does it drive action at the scale and speed that is required to meet a net zero 1.5 degree future? Or is this just about a few people who want low carbon getting access to low carbon and everything else doesn't change? I mean, why the guidance? I think that's the question. Why?
Yeah, definitely. I think I would answer this question from two perspectives. So one thing, our original hypothesis was, the buyers, they want to reduce their Scope 3 emissions, and then they want to procure the greener products to reduce their Scope 3 emissions so that they can reduce their, meet their corporate goal. And then after we have conducting those pilots with the buyers, we actually realized it's not a simple answer. There is also a question of the producers, like why they're not taking action now, and what are preventing them from taking actions. I think the answer is, first of all, they are not sure if the data, the product level data they collected, are accurate or credible or not. So they cannot make decisions. And second of all, just based on one PCF, the product level data, they cannot tell if this emission is additional, like if any additional actions has been taken to reduce emissions. And if there is no proof of those additional reduction efforts, why should I pay? So I think that is a gap we want to drive so that we have those additional metrics that contribute to more transparency to buyers so that they can, assess the reduction efforts from a more comprehensive perspective and then make their corporate decisions on that. But I think from this, use the data and take action, there is a still gap. Like, can I take action in scale? Or is my action, is there any risks involved in this? Should I buy more scrap? Should I, support primary production? And how that can be different? What should I do? So there are still a lot of questions not answered by the guidance itself. That is why we think collaboration and more this kind of efforts are important.
I mean, it's tied to a question that's come in. It's in the Q&A. Let me answer that live actually and show people what it is that product category rules already exist. People are already putting out, EPDs, environmental product declarations and things like that. How does your guidance add anything to that? How does it, if it's in conflict with some of those, what's the niche that it's trying to fill?
Yeah, maybe I can address that question a little bit, giving an example of one of the pilots that we ran. And we'll publish the results in the next coming months. But for one of our pilots involving aluminum, we use the building sector as an example, and we tried to implement our guidance for a particular product that is used for buildings, the curtain wall system. And so traditionally for the curtain wall system, when the building owner or the architectural engineering firm, when they receive the data, they get the data based on like a PCR that exists for the curtain wall, and the data is reported in tons of CO2 equivalent for the entire curtain wall per meter square of the curtain wall. But that's a simple single metric that doesn't provide much information to the building owners in terms of whether they're actually decarbonizing the aluminum sector by purchasing a certain low embodied emissions curtain wall. What our guidance does is, okay, so you have the aluminum frame that is used for the curtain wall. What's the emission intensity for the aluminum frame? But even going up a little bit in the upstream process, like what's the emission intensity of the billet that is used to make that frame? That's a metric that is included in our guidance. And what's the recycled content of that billet, and so on and so forth. Having all these metrics reported to the building owner and to the architectural engineering firm provides an additional transparency on decision making.
So that flows through. You're not just asking for your kind of tier one. You're not just asking for the next supplier up to have done the maths according to the guidance. You're asking for the metrics, recycled content, not just to flow from the cast house, but to flow right the way through to the fabricator. Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I'm interested to get some Q&A questions from folks on that, because that is a, that requires traceability, right? I mean, you talked earlier on about mass balance, and we have a mass balance approach for COC, but that's a true kind of traceability system.
Yeah, I guess eventually that's where we want to get to. Like have the information transfer across different actors of the supply chain.
Okay, and on the specific product level. Wow. Yeah. Okay, that's neat. So we, maybe I've had some questions actually about how ASI interacts with the RMI guidance, and maybe it's to say right now, your product level accounting, our method, which we're publishing in January, is a kind of entity level. It's not product level, although it is based on a cross portfolio emissions intensity at certain points in the value chain. And I would say that for primary aluminium, measured at the cast house output, although I recognize that you have some molten metal values in there too, I think we're pretty well aligned, right? It's cradle to gate, bauxite mining right the way through to the post electrolysis. In subsequent phases, though, I think there is a difference. As it's a procurement approach, Scope 3 Category 1's coming into the entity rather than product specific. So I'll encourage people, when ours is published in January, to look at some of those differences. I think we're pretty much aligned on availability of data and transparency, but some of the specifics around scope, I think people should be aware that there are kind of differences between those two approaches, because they're for different things, right? We've talked already. Yours is about market differentiation for products. Ours is about long-term target setting, and then moving towards those targets through procurement and other means over time. So they interact, but they're not quite for the same ends. Returns to my, I think, statement at the beginning that we're developing lots of different tools for lots of different reasons. We're looking for harmonization, but at the same time, it's not all going to look the same because it's being used for different reasons. We have some questions on allocation, and I think there's a statement in here: "Cutoff is not helpful." I imagine you heard that quite a few times during the public consultation, and also heard, so is avoided burden. So we probably don't want to get into a discussion now of which one is best, but I'm intrigued a little bit as to how the discussion broadly evolved and how you tackled that quite a contentious issue, right? I think at ASI, in our method, we've kind of avoided it by saying it's up to the cast house to choose. But yeah, I'd be interested to see a little bit on how that discussion evolved and got you to where you ended up on the allocation, specifically to pre-consumer scrap.
Benjamin, do you want to address that question?
Yeah, sorry, can you repeat your question again? I was
yes,
trying to
it's just
answer for the questions.
A question of how that scrap allocation discussion evolved. I'm intrigued as to how you started, what, don't have to go through all the comments, but how you ended up where you ended up.
Yeah, exactly. So I think this question was like one of the most controversial questions that we have received by the time we entered this industry. And we had rounds and rounds and rounds of discussions in the pre-working group meetings, the working group meetings, where we proposed our ideas, where we think what are the risks, what are the benefits, compare the pros and cons of each different methodologies, and also understand more on the data challenge for doing the different type of calculations. And then in one of the working groups, where the benefits were like the environmental benefits of doing or like assigning emissions for pre-consumer scrap to further differentiate pre and post-consumer scrap. So after that specific meeting, we have had a round of survey for the buyers who has been involved in that working group. And the question was specific, like, do you think assigning emissions to pre-consumer scrap has environmental benefits? Can you understand the challenge of doing this calculation? And do you think this is a good thing to do? And for most of the answers we collected, I do not have a number on my hand, but I can be assured that most of the buyers told us that they understand the benefits and they think this is a future direction that we can try to push forward because they believe differentiating pre and post consumer scrap is kind of important. But on the different side, when we're trying to do the pilot testing for one of the case where we're really trying to trace the pre-consumer scrap for a producer and figure out what exactly are those emissions are, it has been very, very challenging. There is a lot of issues for, I don't know how my supplier, like where do they buy the scrap? How, like, is that a mix of the scrap? What are the sources of them? How can I assign emissions to that? In the end, we have to utilize some of the default regional emission factors to do this calculation. So I would think, first of all, this data challenge is huge, and so well as to the scrap traceability thing. Like, people really need to figure out or like start to build those kind of scrap traceability system and the data system, the database for scrap to be able to conduct those calculations. And then second of all, I think beyond the calculation stuff, I think the behavioral change that is the thing that we really want to drive. It is to drive the suppliers to get more understanding and transparency of how they source scrap, and also on the same, at the same side, for the buyers to better understand how those calculations are conducted, what is the main purpose of doing this, what is the exact direction that you want to drive your supplier to do. It is a post-consumer scrap. It is not pre-consumer. The focus should be on post-consumer scrap. It's not pre. So our suggestion is, we should direct our focus more towards post-consumer scrap, figure out how we can improve the recycling of those instead of, doing the accurate emission assigning work and accounting work for pre-consumer scrap. I think that is overall, rationale and decision-making process, a whole long story that we have gone through. But we're still learning. We're still trying to drive the industry to move forward, to make change, to take actions instead of discussing which method is the best.
I mean, it's interesting because if you look at the discussion of these different allocation approaches, and you're looking at scrap users, pre-consumer scrap users, and who are they competing with, and who these discussions they're between scrap users and low carbon primary producers, right? Everyone's having a lot of chat down here, and meanwhile, there's a whole heap of high emitting primary over here that's not even engaged in that conversation, where most of the emissions lie. I mean, that is, at the heart of it. I think that's why for our method, we bypassed a little bit of some of these discussions, because we were like, kind of fed up with the discussion. Someone just needs to take action. And to be honest, it's the high emitting primary that needs to take action first and, furthest. That's where it lies. I would say, though, that there is something to be said for, those buyers aren't just buyers. They're also producers. They are producers of scrap themselves. I think that's something that we started to tackle within ASI, and then we've kind of dropped it for now. But that pre-consumer scrap is not just about not caring about that. That has to be reduced in itself. The generation of pre-consumer scrap needs to come down, as well as getting more post-consumer with better quality as well. So there's a role to be played for the industrial users of this material, not just to procure, but to have efficient processes that make the best use of the material that's in hand. So, it'd be interesting to see how some of these approaches develop in the future on that front. It's not just about what you procure; it's about what you do with the material you have procured. We've got some technical questions coming. We've got a little bit. Sorry, please, Trevor.
No, I was just gonna answer one question in the Q&A, especially regarding reporting time period.
Yes.
So for that question, just to repeat, how is time frame or reporting considered? Is it last year's activity? How does it represent new sales that happen in a future year? So I guess for that, our answer is the metrics that are reported for a product should be as relevant as possible for the products that are actually received by the buyer. So that's our general response. And for now, what we say is, last reporting year's average values should be fine for now. But generally speaking, the metrics that the buyers receive should be as relevant to the products as possible. So that's the short answer to that.
And what does reporting mean? Is that kind of verified data publicly disclosed? Is it sharing that with your customers?
So I think it can just be like a simple business to business reporting. It doesn't have to be like publicly reported anywhere. Like you can see a scenario where the buyer asks for the information as part of their like request for quotes or other sort of like procurement processes, and the producers can report that that information as requested in the RFQ documents. So that's can be like a simple B2B.
Okay, so that answers one of the questions that came in as well, is that about the difficulty of getting supplier-based emission factors for primary, and you're seeing this as driving that shift towards the availability of upstream data, right?
Yeah. I guess the way we see it is like eventually if these downstream buyers push for more and more primary data, that will force the producers to use more and more primary data. That's how we see this is gonna play out eventually. Like the demand is gonna drive for like more transparency.
It's interesting. I always struggle with this a bit. Is that the smaller the number, that comes in your procurement, the more accurate you need it to be. And yet that's not the change you necessarily want. Do you tackle in your guidance some of those balances between materiality and accuracy and data flowing through? Like if you're 25 tons per ton, to be honest, I don't care about your decimal place. You know.
Yeah, that's true. I just want to quickly add some of the observations that we have collected from the pilot testing, actually. So we do think getting supplier specific data is very challenging, and there are different reasons for that. Some of the producers may be in a geography where they just have a very bad data infrastructure, so that they are just the beginners of this game. And for some of the producers, they probably just lack of the appropriate tools or resource to hire some kind of consultant to do those product level calculations for them, or do not have those equipment for either monitoring or those data collection efforts. So that actually is exactly the next step that we are going to do. So we're trying to collaborate with other organizations who are also interested in this piece to figure out, what are some of the capacity building things that we can do to support the suppliers be able to do those calculations. What are some of the calculation tools that we can develop, or what are some of the training lessons that we can co-develop with either industry associations or like other organizations that we can provide to, help those beginners pick up their speed, so that the data infrastructure and the database, those suppliers would be able to have a better starting point to quickly pick up their speed for reporting.
Well, that's fantastic. That's a great place to end, actually, because we are at time, and is to say, I guess, that we have a range of aluminium industry participants, both within our membership and also within the attendees today. And I'm sure you won't mind me saying that if they have questions or comments or want to be part of that process, to get in touch with you directly, but also to say that we have a long-standing relationship with RMI, of course, members of ASI as well, and so I welcome feedback from the membership too, in any way that we can engage in ongoing work with RMI. With that, thank you very much, Wenjuan, Shravan, and Nicole, and Ulla and Hao as well. And thank you, the audience, for some great questions. We did have some left over. We didn't get to them all, as usual. So maybe we'll share those with RMI and hopefully can share some of written feedback afterwards. That might be quite useful for folks as well. As usual, this webinar will be posted publicly on the ASI website in the last couple of weeks. And I saw a note to say that RMI were happy for these slides, or at least a version, to be shared with participants. So we'll be following that afterwards. Thank you very much, Sharon, Wenjuan, Nicole.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
See you on the next 45 minutes on.